In the high valleys of Bhutan, where morning mist clings to ancient rhododendron forests like silk threads caught between gentle fingers, there lived a woman whose name has dissolved into the mountain winds, yet whose work still whispers through sacred spaces and ceremonial halls. They called her simply the Weaver of Paro Valley. Though she wandered far beyond those verdant slopes, carrying patterns in her mind that some say came from dreams older than the monasteries themselves. Whether you're nestled beneath warm blankets in a bustling city or resting in the quietness of countryside, wherever sleep is beginning to call your name tonight, I hope you've found that perfect position where your body can truly release the day. If this gentle tale of threads and traditions brings you even a moment of peace, a soft like helps other weary souls discover this restful refuge too. Let your shoulders soften now, feeling how they can release downward, melting like butter ghee in a warm copper bowl. Notice how your breathing is already beginning to deepen, each exhale carrying away something you no longer need to hold. The weight of your body settling, sinking, finding its natural resting place against your bed. Time is gently carrying us back through layers of mountain mist, back to a small village perched like a prayer flag station between earth and sky. The year was perhaps 1892, though in these remote valleys where seasons moved like honey and generations blended into one flowing tapestry, exact dates mattered less than the rhythm of monsoons and the timing of barley harvests. The village of Dramitsa sat cradled in a natural bowl of mountains, 5 days' walk from the nearest market town. Accessible only by paths that switched back and forth across cliffsides where blue poppies grew wild and yaks grazed on meadows that touched the clouds. Here, in a traditional farmhouse built of rammed earth and timber, its walls thick enough to hold warmth through winter nights when snow leopards prowled the ridgelines. A child was born during the gentle hours before dawn. Her mother, Fema, had been weaving through the early stages of labor, her fingers moving across the backstrap loom in the same rhythm as her breathing, creating patterns that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The baby arrived with the first rays of sun painting the peaks golden, and the village astrologer, summoned from his meditation cave, noted how unusual it was that she made no sound, not from distress, but from a profound quietness, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Her eyes, when they finally opened, held the deep brown of polished walnut wood and tracked the movement of dust motes floating through beams of morning light with an attention that made the midwife pause. They named her Dechen, meaning great bliss, though she would grow to be known by many other names throughout her journey. Names that floated away like incense smoke once their purpose was complete. In those early years, while other children ran laughing through terraced fields of buckwheat, Dechen would sit for hours beside her mother's loom, her small fingers reaching toward the threads but never quite touching, as if she were learning their songs through the air itself. The house where she grew held 3 generations of women weavers. Her grandmother, Yangchen, whose fingers had grown gnarled but still moved with the memory of 10,000 patterns, would sit in the winter kitchen where the Bukhari stove spread warmth like a blessing, spinning yak wool into threads so fine they seemed made of mist. The wheel would turn, its rhythm matching the old woman's stories about textile spirits who lived in the warp and weft, teaching those who listened carefully how to weave protection into cloth. Every thread holds intention, Grandmother Yangchen would murmur, her voice soft as the wool passing through her fingers. What you think while spinning becomes part of the thread. What you feel while weaving becomes part of the pattern. This is why we must keep our hearts peaceful, our minds clear as mountain streams. Young Dechen absorbed these teachings through her skin, through her breath, through long afternoons when summer rain drummed on the wooden roof and the whole house smelled of wool and wood smoke. She learned that certain patterns could only be woven during specific moon phases, that some dyes required prayers whispered at exact moments during the brewing, that the most sacred designs were never written down but passed from mind to mind through watching, always watching. By the age of 7, when most children were just learning basic weaving techniques, Dechen could already identify different silk qualities by touch alone. Her fingers would ghost over the surfaces, distinguishing between threads from lowland silkworms fed on mulberry and the rarer mountain silk from moths that lived in oak forests. She knew which would hold dyes like secrets and which would shimmer with their own inner light. The village existed in a rhythm all its own. Mornings began before the sun touched the valley floor with the sound of prayer wheels turning and water buffalo lowing in the mist. Women would gather at the communal water source, their voices mixing with the splash of filling vessels, sharing news that traveled up and down the mountain paths like birds. Men tended the fields where red rice grew in terraces, carved by ancestors whose names had become part of the mountain itself. In this world of repetitive beauty, where days folded into each other like fabric, Dechen's unusual gifts began to reveal themselves gradually. She would sometimes stop mid-step while crossing the courtyard, her head tilted as if listening to distant music. Then hurry to the loom room where she would trace patterns in the air that her mother had been planning to weave but hadn't yet spoken aloud. "How did you know?" her mother would ask, wonder softening her voice. But Dechen would just smile that quiet smile of hers and return to on whatever corner she had been occupying. Usually near the storage room where finished textiles were kept wrapped in special bark paper that repelled insects. She loved that room with its smell of cedar and cloves, where ceremonial gos and kiras hung like sleeping spirits, where the silk threads seemed to hum with stories of the ceremonies they had witnessed. The monsoon season of her 8th year brought a visitor who would change the course of Dechen's life, though at the time he seemed just another traveler seeking shelter from the endless rain. His name was Karma Dorji, and he came from the monastery at Tango, carrying messages between religious communities scattered across the kingdom like stars across the night sky. He arrived at dusk, his robe sodden, water streaming from his bamboo hat. The family welcomed him as tradition demanded, offering butter tea and buckwheat cakes, a place by the fire where steam rose from his drying clothes like prayers. But when he saw the textiles hanging in the main room, particularly a half-finished piece on Dechen's mother's loom, he grew very still. "This pattern," he said slowly, studying the emerging design of interlocking endless knots and lotus blooms. "I have seen it only once before, in a Thangka painting that is said to be 300 years old. How do you know it? Dechen's mother looked puzzled. It came to me in a dream. Though now that you mention it, my daughter seemed to know what I would weave before I had even strung the loom. The monk's eyes found Dechen where she sat in the shadows, not hiding, but simply preferring the edges of rooms where she could observe without being observed. He said nothing more that evening, but she felt his attention like sunlight, warm but not intrusive, curious but not demanding. The rain continued for 3 days, during which time Karma Dorji watched Dechen work. She had her own small loom now, one her grandfather had made specially for her smaller frame, and on it she was creating something that made the monk's breathing change. It wasn't a complex pattern, not technically difficult, but there was something about the way the colors moved together. Deep indigo flowing into saffron like sunset into water, that created an optical effect of gentle movement, as if the textile were breathing. "Where did you learn this technique?" he asked on the third morning, as rain still whispered against the windows. "The threads taught me," Dechen replied simply, her voice barely louder than the sound of her shuttle passing through the warp. "If you listen, they tell you where they want to go." That afternoon, when the rain finally gentled to a mist that made the whole valley look like it was floating, Karma Dorji spoke privately with Dechen's parents. There was a tradition, he explained, older than the kingdom itself, of master weavers who created textiles not just for beauty or warmth, but as spiritual tools. These weavers were rare, perhaps 1 or 2 in a generation, and they required special training that balanced the practical with the mystical. "Your daughter," he said, choosing his words as carefully as someone stepping across a mountain stream on wet stones. "She has the gift, but more than that, she has the quietness necessary to develop it fully. The monastery has need of someone who can create the ceremonial textiles, the ones used in the most sacred rituals. Would you consider?" The conversation continued late into the evening. Voices soft in the kitchen while Dechen sat at her loom. Not weaving now, but running her fingers along the stretched threads like someone playing a silent instrument. She knew without anyone telling her that her life was about to change. Could feel it in the way the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. But change in these mountains came slowly, like the weathering of rocks, like the growth of rhododendrons that might add only an inch in a year. It would be another full season before arrangements were made, before the proper ceremonies were performed, before the astrologer confirmed that the timing was auspicious. During those months of waiting, Dechen's sensitivity to the threads deepened. She began to see patterns everywhere, in the way frost formed on windows, in the flight paths of cranes migrating south, in the wrinkles around her grandmother's eyes when she smiled. Everything was connected, she realized. Everything was part of one vast textile that stretched beyond what eyes could see. Her grandmother, knowing what was coming, began teaching her the deepest secrets, the patterns that were never shown to outsiders, the ones that were said to provide actual protection to those who wore them. These required not just technical skill, but a particular state of mind, a clearness that was like becoming water, transparent, flowing, reflecting everything while holding to nothing. The most powerful textiles Yangchen whispered one evening as stars emerged one by one above the valley, are the ones where the weaver disappears, where there is no signature, no claim, just pure intention woven into form. Remember this, little one. The greatest weavers are the ones whose names are forgotten, but whose work continues to bless. Winter arrived early that year, snow falling like cotton from the sky, covering the terraced fields until the whole valley looked like it had been carved from white jade. Inside the house, life continued its ancient rhythm. Fire crackling in the bukhari, the sound of spinning wheels, the soft thump of the loom beater compacting threads, steam from butter tea rising like incense. Dechen spent these shortened days creating a special textile, one that would be her parting gift to her family. She worked on it only in the early morning hours, when the house was still sleeping and the world outside was muffled by snow. The pattern seemed to emerge from the intersection of her grandmother's teachings and something older, something that whispered through her dreams. She used threads her mother had spun from the finest wool, dyed with plants she had gathered herself during autumn, madder root for deep red, walnut hulls for brown, wild indigo for blue that was almost black. But there were also threads of silk so fine they were nearly invisible, given to her by her grandmother from a store that had been passed down for generations. Threads that were said to have been spun by the first weavers, the ones who learned from the spider goddess herself. As winter deepened and the day of her departure approached, Dechen worked with increasing focus. The pattern that emerged was unlike anything her family had seen. It showed mountains, but mountains that seemed to breathe, valleys that held light like cupped hands, and through it all a path that wound like a river, or perhaps like a thread, connecting every element into wholeness. Her mother, finding her one dawn bent over the loom with tears on her cheeks, started to speak, then stopped, understanding that this textile was more than a gift. It was Dechen's way of weaving herself into the fabric of home, ensuring that even when she was gone, part of her would remain. The monk, Karma Dorji, returned. Just as the first hints of spring touched the valley, when streams began to sing under their shells of ice and the air carried promises of green, he brought with him a letter from the head weaver at Tango Monastery, a woman known only as Ama Lamo, Mother Goddess, who was said to be over 90 years old but still created textiles that made grown men weep with their beauty. She has been waiting, Karma Dorji said simply. She says she dreamed of your daughter before she was born. The leaving ceremony was small. Family and a few village elders gathering in the prayer room where butter lamps flickered like stars brought down to earth. Dechen's completed textile was unveiled. And even Karma Dorji, who had seen the sacred weavings in the greatest monasteries, drew in his breath sharply. It was alive somehow. Though it hung still on the wall, there was a quality of movement within it, as if it were a window into another realm where mountains walked and rivers flew. Her grandmother, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks, reached out to touch it, then pulled her hand back. "No," she whispered. "It is complete. To touch it would be to add something unnecessary." They left on a morning when mist filled the valley like milk in a bowl. Dechen walked beside the monk, her few possessions in a bundle on her back, including her small loom and a selection of threads her mother and grandmother had prepared. Behind them, the family stood in the doorway, figures becoming increasingly ghost-like in the mist until they seemed part of the mountain itself. The path wound downward at first, crossing streams that giggled like children, passing through forests where pine needles had created a carpet so thick their footsteps made no sound. Dechen had never been this far from home, yet she felt no fear, only a curious expansion, as if she were a thread being pulled through space, creating a line that would forever connect where she had been with where she was going. They walked in comfortable silence. Karma Dorji understood that words would only disturb what was happening within the child. This transition from one life to another required a certain quietness, like the pause between breathing in and breathing out. He had made this journey with 3 other young weavers over his years of service, but none had shown Dechen's particular quality of presence, the way she seemed to be listening to everything simultaneously. At midday, they stopped beside a stream where prayer flags fluttered from a wooden bridge worn smooth by countless crossings. While they ate sampa mixed with butter tea, an old woman appeared on the path, bent nearly double under a load of firewood. Without hesitation, Dechen rose and took half the bundle, carrying it across the bridge despite the woman's protests. "Why?" Karma Dorji asked, not critically but with genuine curiosity. "The threads," Dechen replied, adjusting the wood on her small back. "Everything is connected by threads. When I help her, I strengthen the thread between us. It makes the whole fabric stronger." The old woman blessed them both before disappearing up a side path, and they continued their journey, climbing now up and up, through landscapes that changed like movements in a symphony, from pine forest to rhododendron groves, from rhododendron to alpine meadows where gentians grew in pools of impossible blue. As afternoon shadows grew long, painting the mountains purple and gold, they reached a high pass marked by a massive stupa, its white dome like a full moon come to rest on earth. Prayer flags radiated from its peak in every direction, creating a web of color against the sky. Some were so old they had become transparent, just whispers of fabric, while others snapped bright and new in the wind. "Rest here a moment," Karma Dorji said, and Dechen sat on a flat stone worn smooth by other travelers. Looking back, she could see the valley she had come from, though her village was hidden in its secret fold. Looking forward, the path disappeared into clouds that clung to the mountainside like wool to a spindle. The wind at this height sang through the prayer flags, creating harmonies that shifted with each gust. Dechen closed her eyes and listened. Really listened. And in that singing she heard something that made her understand why she had been brought this way. The flags were teaching, showing how intention could be woven into fabric and then released to the wind, how prayers could become physical and then dissolve back into spirit, over and over. The eternal rhythm of form and formlessness. When she opened her eyes, the sun was setting, turning the clouds into a textile of rose and gold that stretched across the entire sky. Karma Dorji was watching her with that quiet attention she had come to recognize. "You hear it?" he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, then asked, "Is this why I'm going to the monastery?" To learn to weave prayers into the wind? Perhaps, he replied, standing and adjusting his robes. Or perhaps to learn that everything, every action, every thought, every thread is already a prayer, if we have the quietness to perceive it. They descended in gathering dusk, the path now winding through a forest of ancient oaks where twilight seemed to live permanently in the spaces between trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hermit's bell rang 3 times. The sound, traveling through the forest like ripples through still water. By the time they reached the monastery gates, stars had emerged in their thousands, the Milky Way arching overhead like a celestial bridge. Or perhaps, Dechen thought, like the greatest textile ever woven, made of light and darkness in perfect balance. The gates were massive, carved with protective deities whose faces were barely visible in the darkness. But they opened at Karma Dorji's approach, revealing a courtyard lit by butter lamps that created pools of golden light. The buildings rose on all sides, their white walls ghostly in the darkness, windows glowing like eyes full of warm secrets. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the particular grace of someone who has spent a lifetime in meditation. She was smaller than Dechen had expected, the famous Ama Lamo, but her presence filled the courtyard like water filling a vessel. Her face was a landscape of wrinkles, each line earned through decades of attention, of watching, of creating. She said nothing at first, just looked at Dechen with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something essential. Then she smiled, and her whole face transformed, became young somehow, ageless. "So," she said, her voice like wind through silk, "you are the one who listens to threads?" It wasn't a question, but Dechen nodded anyway, suddenly shy in the presence of this woman who was said to have woven textiles that could heal, that could protect, that could open doorways between worlds. "Come," Amalamo said, turning toward one of the buildings. "There is much to learn, and despite what the eager young monks might tell you, we have all the time in the world. Weaving cannot be rushed, just as you cannot hurry a plant into blooming. Everything in its season, everything in its perfect time." She led Dechen through corridors where the walls themselves seemed to breathe with centuries of accumulated prayer, their surfaces painted with fading murals of deities whose eyes followed their movement with benevolent attention. The floors, worn smooth by generations of feet, created a path of polished wood that gleamed in the butter lamplight like a dark river, reflecting their passage in ripples of shadow and gold. They climbed a narrow staircase that spiraled upward, the wood creaking gently under their weight, a sound that was somehow comforting, like the settling of an old house preparing for sleep. Through small windows cut into the thick walls, Dechen caught glimpses of the valley below, where scattered lights marked villages she had never known existed, each one a small constellation of human life, sustained by the same rhythms that had shaped her own childhood. The weaving hall occupied the entire top floor of the building, and when Amalamo pushed open the heavy wooden door, Dechen's breath caught in her throat. The room stretched longer than any indoor space she had ever seen, with windows on 3 sides that would, in daylight, flood the space with the kind of light weavers dream about. But now, in the deep quiet of night, Butter lamps created pools of golden illumination that made the dozens of looms look like sleeping creatures, their frames casting intricate shadows that interwove on the ceiling. "This is where you will work," Amal Hamo said softly, leading her past loom after loom, some holding partially completed textiles that even in the dim light showed patterns of extraordinary complexity. "But not yet. First, you must unlearn." The old woman's quarters were attached to the weaving hall, a small series of rooms that smelled of sandalwood and aged silk. In the main room, cushions were ranged around a low table where a single butter lamp burned. Its light revealed walls covered with textiles, but these were different from any Dechen had seen. They seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, patterns shifting subtly as she looked at them, as if they were breathing or dreaming. "Sit," Amalyamo said, lowering herself onto a cushion with the fluid grace of someone who had found perfect ease within an aging body. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at thread?" Dechen settled onto her cushion, feeling the cool air of the mountain night through the windows, hearing somewhere in the distance the sound of monks chanting their evening prayers, their voices rising and falling like waves against the shore of silence. "I see possibility," she said finally. "Each thread holds every pattern it might become, like a seed holds a tree." Amal Hamo nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Dechen's face. "And what do you hear?" "Stories," Dechen whispered. "Sometimes songs, sometimes just breathing." The old woman smiled then. That transformation happening again, where years seemed to fall away from her face. "Good, very good. Most students take years to reach that understanding. But you were born knowing. This makes my task both easier and harder." She rose and moved to a wooden chest in the corner, its surface carved with symbols so worn they were barely visible. From within, she withdrew something wrapped in silk, so old it had become the color of moonlight. Carefully, reverently, she unwrapped it, revealing a spindle unlike any Dechen had seen. It was made of some dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And attached to it was a length of thread that appeared to be spun from silver or starlight, or perhaps just from possibility itself. "This belonged to my teacher's teacher's teacher," Amal Hamo said, placing it carefully in Dechen's hands. "Some say it is even older than that it was used by the first weaver, the one who learned directly from the spider goddess. Feel it." The spindle was surprisingly warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight rather than stored in a dark chest. And the thread. When Dechen touched it, she heard something that made her gasp. Not a song or a story, but silence. Perfect, complete silence that was somehow fuller than any sound. This thread, Amalamo explained, was spun in meditation so deep that the spinner ceased to exist, became one with the action of spinning. There was no weaver, only weaving, no maker, only making. This is what you must learn. Not techniques, those you already know, but how to disappear. The training began the next morning before dawn, when the world was still more dream than reality. Dechen was awakened not by bells or voices, but by Amal Hamo's presence outside her small cell, waiting with the patience of mountains. They walked to the weaving hall in darkness, their feet knowing the way, and sat before empty looms as the first light began to seep through the eastern windows. "Watch," Amalhamu said, and began to work. But she wasn't weaving, not exactly. She was moving her hands through the empty loom as if threads were there, her fingers following patterns that existed only in imagination, or perhaps in some realm where all patterns lived before they became physical. Dechen watched, mesmerized, as the old woman's movements became increasingly fluid, until it seemed she was conducting music only she could hear. "Now you," she said, moving to sit beside Dechen. "Don't think, just move. Let your hands remember what they've never learned." It felt foolish at first, pretending to weave on an empty loom. But gradually, as the room filled with pale light, and somewhere in the monastery, the morning prayers began. Dechen felt something shift. Her hands began to move of their own accord, following patterns that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath thought. She could almost see the threads, translucent as spider silk, forming and dissolving with each movement. Days passed in this strange practice, weaving without thread, creating without material. Sometimes other students would enter the hall, young women from various valleys who had come to learn the traditional techniques. They would look curiously at Dechen and Amalamo working at their empty looms, but said nothing, understanding that this was some teaching beyond their current comprehension. In the afternoons, when sunlight filled the hall like honey poured into a bowl, Amalhamo would have Dechen work with actual threads, but with her eyes closed, learning to feel the quality of each fiber. Silk from cotton, yak wool from sheep, the rare threads made from nettle fibers that were said to hold protective powers. She learned to identify dyes by scent alone: indigo's sharp tang, madder's earthiness, the sweet smell of onion skin dye. "The eyes can deceive," Amalhamo would say, settling beside her with her own work, a textile that she had been creating for 7 years, adding perhaps 3 rows in a day, sometimes removing what she had woven the day before if it didn't feel right. But the fingers know truth, the nose knows quality, the ears know when tension is correct. Trust everything except what seems obvious. Evenings were for the teaching of patterns, but not in the way Dechen expected. Instead of showing her designs to copy, Amalhamo would tell stories, long winding tales that seemed to have no beginning or end, about weavers from the time before time, when the valleys were lakes and the mountains were young. Stories that folded in on themselves like complex knots, that repeated with variations like musical themes. "There was a weaver," she would begin, the butter lamp flames dancing as if listening, "who discovered that if she wove while thinking of rain, moisture would be drawn to the textile, keeping it soft even in the driest seasons. But if she wove while thinking of sunlight, the fabric would always feel warm, even in the depths of winter." These stories would continue late into the night, and Dechen would fall asleep to the sound of them, the old woman's voice becoming part of her dreams, where she would find herself weaving patterns made of story, textiles constructed from words and silences in equal measure. One morning, perhaps a month into her training, Dechen woke to find a single thread laid across her doorway. It was silk, dyed the deep blue of the sky just before dawn. She picked it up carefully and immediately understood it was an invitation, or perhaps a test. Following instinct, she wound the thread around her finger and let it lead her, not physically but intuitively, down corridors she had never explored, to a room she had never seen. Inside, Ama Lamo sat before a loom, strung with threads so fine they were barely visible. The pattern emerging was impossible. It showed depth that shouldn't exist in a flat textile, mountains that receded into actual distance, clouds that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. This, Amalamo said without preamble, is dream weaving. The threads are spun from the silk of moths that feed only on moonflowers, which bloom for a single night once a year. The dyes come from plants that grow in places where the veil between worlds is thin. But the real secret, she paused, her fingers never stopping their movement across the threads, is that the pattern doesn't come from the mind. It comes from the space between waking and sleeping, the place where all possibilities exist simultaneously. She had Dechen sit beside her, not to watch, but to breathe, to synchronize their breathing until they were inhaling and exhaling as one organism. And gradually, so gradually that Dechen couldn't mark the moment of transition, she began to see the pattern not as it was, but as it was becoming. Threads of possibility spreading out like roots or branches or rivers, all the ways the textile might grow. Choose, Amalhamo whispered, and somehow Dechen understood. She reached out, not with her physical hand, but with intention, and touched one of the possibility threads. Immediately, Amalhamo's hands shifted, following the new direction, weaving the choice into reality. This became their morning practice. This shared dreaming at the loom. Dechen learned that certain patterns could only emerge through this collaboration, designs that no single mind could conceive because they required the intersection of multiple possibilities, the overlapping of different dreams. The monsoon season arrived with its usual drama, clouds building like celestial architecture until they released their burden in torrents that turned paths to streams and streams to rivers. The weaving hall became a refuge not just from weather but from time itself. The sound of rain on the roof created a rhythm that seemed to slow everything down, making each movement deliberate, each breath conscious. During these long grey days, Amalhamo began teaching Dechen about the ceremonial textiles, the ones created for specific rituals and purposes. There were the birth cloths, woven with patterns that would protect newborns from harmful spirits. Marriage textiles that bound not just two people but two family lineages. Death shrouds that helped souls navigate the bardo, the space between lives. Each requires a different state of mind, she explained, working on a textile that would be used in a healing ceremony. The pattern was deceptively simple, just interlocking circles in white and red. But Dechen could feel the intensity of focus required, the way Amalhamo had to hold the image of wholeness, of health, in her mind while her fingers worked. The weaver becomes a bridge, the old woman continued, her voice soft as the rain. Between intention and form, between the sacred and the everyday. This is why we must practice disappearing. If the weaver's ego is present, it blocks the flow, like a knot in a thread. One particularly torrential afternoon, when the rain was so heavy it seemed solid, like curtains of silver closing off the world, a messenger arrived at the monastery. He was soaked through, shivering, urgent with news from a valley 3 days' walk away. A local chieftain's daughter was to be married, but the weaver who had been creating her ceremonial kira had fallen ill. The textile was nearly complete, but the final panel, the one that would contain the protective blessings, remained unwoven. Amalhamo listened to the messenger, then looked at Dechen for a long moment. "You will go?" she said finally. Dechen felt her heart flutter like a prayer flag in wind. "But I've only been studying for a season. I don't know enough." "You know everything necessary," Amalhamo replied, already moving to gather materials. "And more importantly, you know how to listen. The textile will tell you what it needs. Trust that." They prepared through the night. Amalhamo selecting specific threads. Some dyed with materials Dechen had never seen. Others so old they carried the scent of centuries. She wrapped them carefully in oiled cloth to protect them from the rain, along with needles made from different metals, each with its own purpose and power. "This marriage," Amalhamo explained as she packed, "joins two valleys that have been separated by an old dispute. The textile you complete won't just dress a bride. It will weave communities back together. Remember, you're not just working with thread. You're working with relationships, with future possibilities." Before dawn, as rain still fell but softer now, like a blessing rather than a torrent, Dechen set out with the messenger and two monks who would serve as escorts. The path was treacherous, stones slick with water, streams overflowing their banks. But Dechen found herself unafraid, feeling instead a sense of purpose that made each step certain. They traveled through landscapes transformed by water, valleys filled with mist so thick it was like walking through clouds, forests where every leaf dripped diamonds, meadows become temporary lakes reflecting the grey sky like mirrors. At night they sheltered in herders' huts or meditation caves, sharing whatever food they had with whoever they met. Each encounter adding another thread to the web of connection spreading across the mountains. On the third day, as clouds finally began to part, revealing patches of blue like windows into another world, they arrived at the village. It was larger than Dechen's birthplace, but smaller than the monasteries surrounding, perched on a hillside with houses stacked like stairs ascending toward a small temple whose golden roof caught the emerging sunlight. The chieftain's house was obvious, larger than the others, with carved wooden balconies and prayer flags streaming from every corner. Inside, the atmosphere was tense with the particular anxiety that comes before major ceremonies. People moved quickly through room, carrying flowers, preparing food, their voices creating a constant hum of activity. But in the weaving room, there was silence. The textile lay on a large loom, and even Dechen, young as she was in her training, could see it was extraordinary work. The main body showed a garden, but not any earthly garden. This was a place where lotus flowers grew from clouds, where birds made of stars flew through forests of jeweled trees. The colors shifted and changed depending on the angle of viewing, creating an effect of constant gentle movement. The old weaver, Ani Chodin, lay on a bed in the corner, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes, though filmed with illness, were still sharp, watching Dechen with interest rather than concern. "So," she whispered, her voice like wind through dry leaves, "Amalhamo sends me a child." "She sends you her hands," Dechen replied. the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought. "To complete what you have begun." Anichodan smiled, an expression that transformed her worn face. You understand already. Good. Come, let me show you what remains." With effort, she raised herself enough to point at the empty section of the textile. Perhaps a hand's width of warped threads waiting to be filled. But as she explained the pattern that should go there, the symbolic meaning of each element, Dechen began to understand the complexity of what was being asked. This final panel needed to contain specific protective symbols, but woven in such a way that they appear to be simply part of the garden, hidden but present, secret but active. It required not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of the symbolic language, the way certain patterns could contain multiple meanings depending on how they were perceived. "The bride," Anichodan explained, sinking back onto her pillows, "comes from a family of warriors, the groom from a lineage of teachers. The textile must honor both, must create a bridge between action and contemplation, between the sword and the book." Dechen sat at the loom as afternoon light slanted through the windows. Her fingers traced the threads already woven, feeling the rhythm Anichodan had established, the particular tension she preferred, the way she had hidden tiny imperfections that would remind the wearer of humility, of the perfect imperfection of human life. She closed her eyes, letting her breathing slow, feeling for that space Ama Lahamo had shown her, between waking and sleeping, between thought and action, and gradually, like an image emerging from mist, she began to see what was needed. Not a pattern exactly, but a feeling, a quality that wanted to express itself through thread and color. She saw sword blades that were also leaves, books whose pages became birds, symbols that transformed depending on the viewer's need, protection that adapted to circumstances. Her hands began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. She wasn't following a pattern but listening to a conversation between what was and what wanted to be. The threads seemed to guide her, each one knowing its place in the emerging design. Hours passed unnoticed. The room grew quiet as even Anichodan's labored breathing smoothed into sleep. Somewhere in the house, preparations continued, but the weaving room had become a separate world, a bubble of concentration where time moved differently. As darkness fell and butter lamps were lit, Dechen became aware of others entering the room. The chieftain himself, a man whose presence filled space like water fills a vessel. His wife, elegant in traditional dress, the bride-to-be, young and nervous, her eyes wide as she looked at the textile. But Dechen couldn't stop. She was in the flow now, that state where weaver and weaving become one action, one movement, one breath. The pattern was emerging faster than thought, her fingers knowing what came next before her mind could form the intention. It was nearly midnight when she tied the final knot, cut the last thread. The room had filled with people, drawn by something they couldn't name, a sense that something significant was happening. When Dechen finally stepped back from the loom, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and something else, something like joy, there was complete silence. The final panel was alive. There was no other word for it. The patterns seemed to shift and breathe, showing different images to each viewer. The chieftain saw mountains standing strong, His wife saw rivers flowing together. The bride saw a garden where everything bloomed simultaneously. Eternal spring. How? Someone whispered. But Dechen couldn't answer. Didn't know how to explain that she hadn't woven the pattern, had simply allowed it to weave itself through her. She looked at Ani Choden, who was awake now, tears streaming down her cheeks. Perfect, the old weaver breathed. It's perfect. The wedding took place 3 days later, and Dechen stayed to witness it. The bride wore the completed kira, and as she moved through the ceremonies, the textile seemed to respond, catching light in ways that made her appear to glow. The patterns shifted with her movements, creating an effect of constant transformation, constant becoming. But more than the visual beauty, there was something else, a quality that affected everyone present. The two families, who had maintained polite distance for generations, began to intermingle. Conversations started spontaneously. Laughter arose naturally. By the end of the ceremony, it was as if the old tensions had been unwoven, replaced by new patterns of connection. The journey back to the monastery was different from the journey out. News of the textile had already begun to spread. In each village they passed through, people came to ask Dechen about it. Some brought threads they had spun, asking her to bless them. Others simply wanted to touch her hands, as if the ability to weave such patterns might transfer through contact. But Dechen felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. This wasn't what Amalamo had taught. The weaver was supposed to disappear, not become visible. She began traveling at night, sleeping during the day in hidden places, trying to return to the anonymity that felt truer to her purpose. When she finally reached the monastery, slipping through the gates in pre-dawn darkness, Ama Lamo was waiting in the weaving hall. She said nothing, just gestured for Dechen to sit beside her at the loom where she continued her 7-year textile. They wove together in silence as the sun rose, filling the hall with light that made the threads glow like captured fire. And gradually, Dechen understood that this too was part of the teaching, the returning, the integration, the way experiences needed to be woven back into daily practice, or they would remain separate, isolated, unable to nourish future work. You did well, Amalamo said finally, her fingers never pausing in their movement. But now you understand the danger. When power flows through us, when we become conduits for something greater, there is always the temptation to claim it, to say, I did this. But the moment we grasp, we lose the very thing that made the magic possible. Dechen nodded, feeling the truth of this in her bones, in the exhaustion that came not from the weave-in itself, but from the effort of maintaining herself as separate from it. She had touched something during those hours at Ani Choden's loom, a state where boundaries dissolved, where the pattern existed everywhere simultaneously, and she was simply the place where it chose to manifest. This is why, Amalhamo continued, the greatest weavers leave no names, no signatures. Their work speaks, but they remain silent. They become rumors, whispers, legends that may or may not be true. This protects both the work and the worker, keeps the channel clear for the next pattern that needs to emerge. The seasons turned like prayer wheels. Spring into summer, into autumn, into winter, and back to spring again. each rotation deepening Dechen's understanding of the subtle relationships between thread and intention, between pattern and purpose. In her second year at the monastery, Amal Hamo began teaching her about the lunar influences on dyeing, how certain colors would only achieve their true depth if the dyeing began under a waning moon, while others required the expansive energy of the full moon to properly bind with the fibers. They would rise in the middle of the night, moving through the sleeping monastery like shadows, to tend the dye pots that bubbled gently in the courtyard. The steam rising from them carried different qualities depending on the ingredients, sometimes sharp and medicinal from walnut holes and iron, sometimes sweet and earthy from madder root, sometimes mysterious and complex from the rare lichens that grew only on north-facing rocks above the tree line. Color is memory, Amal Hamo would murmur, stirring the pots with wooden paddles worn smooth by generations of use. Each plant remembers the soil it grew from, the rain that nourished it, the sun that called it upward. When we dye thread, we are transferring those memories, weaving the essence of place into our work. Dechen learned to read the colors like texts, understanding that the same indigo could produce dozens of different blues depending on the temperature of the dye bath, the pH of the water, the number of times the thread was dipped. She discovered that adding a single grain of saffron to a yellow dye would create a warmth that seemed to generate actual heat. That threads dyed during thunderstorms would forever carry an electric quality that made them perfect for certain protective patterns. During her third year, an elderly weaver from the far eastern valleys arrived at the monastery. Her name was Pema Zangmo, and she carried knowledge that was said to be older than Buddhism itself. Patterns that came from the time when the Bon traditions were the only teachings in these mountains. She had walked for 2 months to reach the monastery, her feet wrapped in rags, her body bent from decades at the loom, but her eyes bright with purpose. "I am the last," she told Amal Hamo simply. "The last who knows the spider patterns. If I don't pass them on, they die with me." The spider patterns were different from anything Dechen had encountered. They weren't really patterns at all in the conventional sense, more like mathematical principles that could generate infinite variations. The story was that they had been given to humans by the spider goddess herself, Lamo Tekpa, who took pity on humans shivering in their caves and taught them to create warmth from fiber. But the patterns came with warnings. They could only be woven by someone whose mind was completely clear, free from personal desire. Otherwise, the weaver would become trapped in the pattern, lost in its infinite recursions. There were stories of weavers who had attempted the spider patterns without proper preparation, who had been found. Days later, still at their looms, their fingers moving automatically, their minds gone wandering in the spaces between threads. Pema Zangmo would only teach at night, when the boundary between waking and sleeping was thinnest. She, Amal Hamo, and Dechen would sit in a circle, no loom between them. And the old woman would move her hands through empty air, tracing patterns that seemed to leave faint traces of light, like the phosphorescence that sometimes appeared in mountain streams. "The spider doesn't plan her web," Pema Zangmo explained, her voice barely louder than breathing. "She simply begins, and the pattern emerges from the interaction between her intention and the space available. each web is unique because each moment, each location, each spider is unique. This is what we must learn, not to impose patterns but to discover them. For weeks, they practiced this discovering, sitting with empty hands, feeling for the patterns that wanted to exist. It was maddening at first, the mind wanting to control, to direct, to create. But gradually, like learning to float in water, Dechen found the knack of it, the way to hold intention without grasping, to direct without controlling. When Pema Zangmo finally allowed them to work with actual thread, the results were extraordinary. Patterns emerged that had never existed before, would never exist again. Each textile became a record of a unique moment, a specific configuration of consciousness, weather, astronomical alignment, and countless other factors too subtle to name. The old woman stayed through the winter, and as snow sealed the mountain passes, making the monastery an island in white, she shared the deeper teachings. The spider patterns weren't just about creating beautiful textiles, they were a practice, a form of meditation that used weaving as a vehicle for consciousness to explore itself. When you truly enter the spider mind, she said one night as snow fell silently outside, you understand that everything is connected, that the thread you're weaving with extends infinitely in all directions, connecting you to every other thread, every other weaver, every other moment of creation. The textile you're making is just one small section of an infinite web that includes everything. That winter was the deepest anyone could remember. Snow fell for days without stopping, until the monastery buildings were connected by tunnels carved through drifts that reached the second-story windows. In this cocoon of white silence, Dechen's sensitivity to the threads deepened beyond anything she had experienced. She began to perceive what she could only describe as the songs of different fibers. Silk sang high and clear, like bells made of ice. Yak wool hummed low and warm, like the earth itself vibrating. Cotton whispered stories of sun and rain, of fields where it had grown. Nettle fiber carried a wild music, untamed and protective. More remarkably, she found she could hear the songs change as they were woven together. Harmonies emerging from the interaction of different fibers, different colors, different tensions. A textile became a symphony, each pattern a movement, each color a tonal shift. She could weave with her eyes closed now, following the music, letting it guide her hands. Spring arrived suddenly that year. Warm winds from the south, melting the snow so fast that streams became torrents, carrying away bridges and sometimes whole hillsides. The monastery was cut off from the lower valleys for weeks, but this isolation felt appropriate, necessary even, for the work that was emerging. Amal Hamo had begun her most ambitious project, a textile that would hang in the main prayer hall, replacing one that was said to be 300 years old, falling apart despite careful preservation. This new piece needed to carry forward the spiritual power of the original while adding something new, something that spoke to the current moment in the monastery's long history. She asked Dechen to help, not as a student, but as a collaborator. They would work on it together, their four hands moving as one, creating patterns through the intersection of their different knowings. It was to be woven primarily from silk, but silk that had been prepared in a special way. Each thread passed through smoke from burning juniper, blessed with mantras. Some left undyed to carry the natural gold of the cocoons. Others dyed with materials gathered from sacred sites. The pattern would tell the story of the monastery's founding, but not literally. Rather, it would capture the quality of that first moment when the founder had looked at this particular configuration of mountains and valleys and recognized it as a place where heaven and earth could meet. It would need to be both historical and timeless, specific and universal, a doorway between worlds. They began on the morning of the summer solstice, when light was at its most abundant, working in shifts, one resting while the other wove. They maintained a continuous rhythm that lasted 3 days and nights. The pattern that emerged was unlike anything either had planned. It showed mountains, but mountains that were also clouds, also waves, also the folds in fabric. It showed the monastery, but in a way that made it appear to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. As word spread about what they were creating, other monks and nuns began to gather in the weaving hall, not to watch, but to meditate. They said the textile generated a field of peace that made meditation effortless, that just being near it caused thoughts to settle like sediment in still water. It was during this time that Dechen began to be called by a new name. Though she never knew who started it, people began referring to her as the Silent Weaver. It fit. She had become increasingly quiet, not from unfriendliness, but from a deepening into listening. She could go days without speaking, her hands doing all her communicating through the patterns she created. Visitors began arriving specifically to commission work from her, though they quickly learned that she didn't work to commission in the traditional sense. Instead, she would sit with them, sometimes for hours, not speaking, just being present. And then, sometimes weeks or months later, a textile would appear, left outside their door or in the prayer hall, unsigned, often transformative in ways they hadn't expected. There was the merchant who had wanted a textile that would bring prosperity to his trading ventures. What he received was a piece that somehow made him understand the anxiety that drove his endless accumulation. He ended up giving away half his wealth and reported later that he had never been happier. There was the mother who wanted a protective cloth for her daughter who was traveling to India for teachings. The textile Dechen created showed patterns that shifted depending on the viewer's state of mind. When the daughter was afraid, she would see images of strength. When she was lonely, she would see connections. The cloth became famous in the teachings houses of India, though no one knew who had made it. As Dechen entered her 4th year at the monastery, Pema Zangmo prepared to leave. The spider patterns had been transmitted, the knowledge preserved for another generation. But before she left, the old woman performed one final teaching. She set up a loom in the courtyard under the stars and began to weave using spider silk itself, collected carefully from webs without harming the creators. The resulting textile was so fine it was barely visible, catching light in ways that made it seem like condensed starlight. But more remarkable was what happened when it was complete. Pema Zangmo held it up to the night sky, whispered something in a language older than memory, and released it. The textile didn't fall. Instead, it dissolved into the air, becoming part of the night, part of the space between stars. This is the ultimate teaching, she said, turning to Dechen and Amalamo. To create beauty and then release it. To weave patterns and let them go. The spider rebuilds her web each day. Not from attachment, but from joy in the creating itself. Remember this. After Pema Zangmo departed, walking back into the mountains with the same steady pace that had brought her, Dechen found herself changed. She understood now that her journey wasn't toward mastery, but toward disappearance. Not becoming a great weaver, but becoming weaving itself. She began experimenting with what she called temporary textiles. Pieces woven from materials that would naturally decompose. Thread spun from flower petals that would fade. Patterns created with frost on winter mornings that would vanish with the first touch of sun. She would spend hours creating elaborate designs in sand, then let the wind take them. Each creation a prayer that gained power through its release. Amalamo watched this evolution with satisfaction, recognizing in Dechen's journey an echo of her own, though each weaver had to find their unique path to the same understanding, that the greatest art was artlessness. The deepest technique was no technique. The most powerful creation was the one that left no trace. One autumn morning, when mist filled the valley like a bowl of milk, a message arrived that would change the direction of Dechen's life. Though she didn't know it at the time, couldn't have imagined how a single request would spiral outward like ripples in water, affecting not just her but the entire tradition of sacred weaving in the Himalayan regions. The message came from a monastery so remote that even its name was uncertain, sometimes called the Nest of Clouds, sometimes the Eagle's Rest, sometimes simply the High Place. It sat at an elevation where most humans couldn't survive long, where the air was so thin that thoughts themselves seemed to require effort. The monks there were said to practice forms of meditation that belonged more to the realm of death than life, spending months in states that barely distinguished from cessation. Their head lama, a man whose age was impossible to determine. Some said 90, some said 130, had requested a specific textile, not for ceremony or protection, but for something he called the final teaching. He had heard rumors of the silent weaver, the one who could weave patterns that existed in multiple dimensions, and he believed she was the only one who could create what was needed. The specifications were unusual. The textile needed to be large enough to wrap a human body, but light enough to float on air. It needed to show patterns that would be visible in complete darkness, but invisible in direct sunlight. Most mysteriously, it needed to remember every hand that touched it, carrying their essence forward in some indefinable way. Amalamo read the message several times, her expression increasingly thoughtful. "This is not a request for a textile," she said finally. "It's a request for a teaching. The Lama is preparing for his transition, and he wants something that will carry his transmission forward after his body is gone." The challenge was unlike anything Dechen had attempted. It would require not just technical skill, but an understanding of consciousness itself, how it could be encoded in matter, how intention could be woven so deeply into fabric that it would persist beyond the weaver, beyond even the wearer. She began by entering a period of intensive meditation, sometimes sitting with Amalhamo, sometimes alone in the caves above the monastery, where hermits had practiced for centuries. She wasn't seeking inspiration or ideas, but rather trying to understand the request at a level deeper than words. What was being asked? What was really needed? The answer came not as a thought but as a feeling, a quality of presence that she recognized from her deepest moments at the loom. When the boundary between creator and creation dissolved, the Lama wasn't asking for a textile. He was asking for a mirror, something that would reflect and amplify the consciousness of whoever encountered it. With this understanding, she began gathering materials, but not in any ordinary way. She would sit in meditation until she felt called to a particular place, a grove of trees, a stream, a high meadow. There she would find what was needed. Sometimes silk from wild cocoons, sometimes plant fibers she had never used before, sometimes mineral pigments that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The preparation of these materials became a practice in itself. Each fiber needed to be cleaned not just physically but energetically, passed through sage smoke, left under moonlight, sometimes buried in earth for specific periods. The dyes were created according to principles she learned not from Ama Lamo or Pema Zangmo, but from the materials themselves, each one teaching her how it wanted to be used. When she finally began weaving, it was winter again. The hall was cold enough that her breath formed clouds, but she worked without gloves, needing the direct connection between her skin and the threads. The pattern emerged slowly, so slowly that sometimes she would add only a single row in a day. Each thread had to be placed with absolute precision, not technical precision but energetic precision, finding its exact place in the emerging whole. What appeared was unprecedented. The textile seemed to exist in multiple layers, as if several different fabrics had been woven in the same space. Looked at directly, it showed simple geometric patterns, pleasant but unremarkable. But in peripheral vision, or in the moments between looking and not looking, other patterns emerged. Landscapes that had never existed, figures that might have been human or divine or both. Symbols that meant different things to each viewer. More remarkably, the textile seemed to change based on who was present. When Amal Hamo sat near it, patterns emerged that spoke of teaching, of transmission, of the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. When young monks approached, they saw patterns that inspired questions, that opened doorways in their understanding. When the kitchen workers came to clean the hall, they saw patterns that reminded them of home, of family, of the simple beauties that made life worth living. As winter deepened and the textile neared completion, strange things began happening in the weaving hall. Sometimes Dechen would arrive in the morning to find that work had progressed in the night, rows added in a style that was hers but not hers, as if her future self had come back to help. Sometimes she would be weaving and feel other hands guiding hers, not forcefully, but gently, showing her techniques she didn't know she knew. Amalamo, observing these phenomena with her usual calm, only said, "The textile is calling its community, drawing together all the threads of knowledge and intention that belong to it. You are not weaving alone. You never have been." The completion came suddenly. One moment Dechen was adding what she thought was just another thread. The next, she understood with absolute clarity that the piece was finished. To add even one more element would be to diminish rather than enhance. She cut the final thread and stepped back, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and exhilaration. The textile hung on the loom like captured aurora borealis, shifting, shimmering, alive with possibilities. Even in the dim winter light, it seemed to generate its own luminosity. Not bright but deep, like looking into clear water and seeing depths that shouldn't exist. But now came the most challenging part. How to transport something so delicate, so energetically complex, to a monastery that sat above the clouds. The journey would take weeks, through terrain that challenged even experienced travelers. The textile needed to arrive not just intact, but with its energetic patterns undisturbed. The answer revealed itself through a dream that came to Dechen during the deep sleep hours before dawn, when the monastery was so quiet that even breathing seemed loud. She saw herself not carrying the textile, but wearing it, letting it rest against her body, where it would be warmed by her heart, protected by her presence. The journey wouldn't be a transportation but a pilgrimage, each step a prayer, each breath a blessing woven into the fabric's memory. When she shared this vision with Ama Lamo, the old woman nodded slowly, thoughtfully, her fingers moving through empty air as if testing invisible threads. "Yes," she said after a long silence filled only by the distant sound of prayer wheels toning in the wind. "The textile needs to learn the journey, needs to absorb the spaces between here and there. This is part of what the Lama is asking for, not just the destination but the path itself." They prepared for weeks, not gathering supplies in the ordinary sense, but entering a state of readiness that was more spiritual than physical. Dechen fasted gently, taking only butter tea and small amounts of tsampa, allowing her body to become lighter, more transparent. She spent hours in meditation, not seeking anything but simply opening, becoming receptive to the journey that wanted to unfold. The textile itself seemed to participate in the preparation. Its colors deepened and softened simultaneously, as if it were aging and becoming younger at the same time. Sometimes when Dechen sat near it, she felt it teaching her, showing her through subtle shifts in its patterns how to navigate the high passes, where to rest, when to move. It had become not just a creation but a companion, a teacher, a friend. The morning of departure arrived grey and soft, with snow falling so gently it seemed the sky was dissolving, shedding itself in tiny pieces that took forever to reach the ground. Ama Lamo helped Dechen wrap the textile around her body, the fabric settling against her like mist, weighing almost nothing yet, carrying the presence of mountains. "Remember," Ama Lamo whispered, her voice already sounding distant, though she stood close enough to touch. "You are not carrying the textile. You are allowing it to travel through you. Be the path, not the walker." The first days passed in a kind of dream. Dechen moved through landscapes that seemed only half real. Valleys filled with clouds that might have been sheep. Forests where the trees grew downward into earth as much as upward into sky. Sometimes she walked. Sometimes she simply stood still and let the world move around her, understanding that movement and stillness were the same thing seen from different perspectives. Other travelers occasionally appeared on the path. Traders with yak caravans, pilgrims heading to distant temples, monks carrying messages between communities. But they seemed to look through rather than at Dechen, as if she had become translucent, part of the landscape rather than separate from it. Only children and animals noticed her directly. Dogs wagging their tails as she passed. Young ones reaching out to touch the textile that peeked from beneath her outer robe, their fingers coming away with expressions of wonder. At night, she would shelter in caves or beneath overhanging rocks, places where hermits had practiced for so long that the stone itself had absorbed something of their peace. The textile would seem to expand in these spaces, its patterns becoming three-dimensional, creating a tent of energy around her. Within this cocoon, she would drift in and out of sleep, sometimes unsure whether she was dreaming or waking, whether the soft voices she heard were real pilgrims passing in the darkness, or the memories of all who had sheltered here before. As she climbed higher, the air thinning with each day's ascent, something began to change in her perception. The boundaries between things became less distinct. Mountains flowed like water frozen in the act of falling. Clouds became solid enough to walk on. The textile around her body felt less like fabric and more like a second skin. Or perhaps her first skin had become fabric. Threads of flesh and threads of silk interweaving until she couldn't distinguish between them. On the 7th day, or perhaps it was the 10th, time had become circular rather than linear. She encountered an old woman sitting beside the path. The woman was spinning thread from clouds, literally pulling wisps of mist from the air and twisting them into strands that gleamed like spider silk. She looked up as Dechen approached, her face so wrinkled it seemed made entirely of laugh lines. "Ah," she said, her voice like wind through grass. The textile that weaves itself, and the weaver who becomes thread. Sit, share my tea. Though I should warn you, it's made from forget-me-nots. And everyone who drinks it forgets something they no longer need to remember. Dechen sat, accepting the wooden bowl of pale blue tea that tasted of sky and distance. As she drank, she felt memories leaving her. Not important ones, but the kind that created weight, old embarrassments, small resentments, the countless ways she had defined herself as separate from the world. Each sip dissolved another boundary until she felt transparent as the air around her. "Better?" the old woman asked, though it wasn't really a question. "The place you're going, the nest of clouds, it exists between breathing in and breathing out, between one heartbeat and the next. You can't arrive there carrying anything extra, not even the weight of your own name." She reached out and touched the textile where it showed beneath Dechen's robe, and where her fingers made contact. New patterns appeared, or perhaps they had always been there, waiting for the right touch to make them visible. Spirals that led inward forever, doorways that opened onto themselves, paths that arrived at their beginning. "The Lama you seek," the woman continued, her own form beginning to fade like morning mist, touched by sun, has been preparing for this textile his whole life, though he only recently remembered. It will help him teach his final lesson, the one that can only be taught by leaving. But more than that, It will continue teaching long after he's gone, long after you're gone, long after even the memory of making it has dissolved. When Dechen looked up from the tea bowl, the old woman was gone, or perhaps had never been, though the patterns her touch had awakened in the textile remained, pulsing gently with their own inner rhythm, like a heartbeat made of light. The path continued upward, though upward had become a relative concept. Sometimes Dechen felt she was walking on the underside of the world, that gravity had reversed and she was falling slowly skyward. The textile helped her navigate these inversions. Its weight, what little weight it had, always pulling her toward where she needed to be. Villages became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. The only signs of human presence were the occasional stone cairns, prayer flags so old they had become transparent, meditation caves carved into cliff sides by centuries of practice. In one such cave, she found a skeleton sitting in perfect meditation posture, still wearing the remnants of robes. Around its neck hung a textile, so old it fell apart when the wind touched it. But in that moment of dissolution, Dechen saw its pattern transfer to her own textile, adding another layer to the infinite layers already present. The air became so thin that breathing required conscious effort. Each inhalation a decision, each exhalation a release. But rather than feeling distressed, Dechen found a strange peace in this necessity. It made every breath precious, intentional, a choice to continue rather than an automatic function. On what might have been the 15th day, though she had long since stopped counting, the path ended. Not abruptly but gradually, fading like a sentence that trails off into silence. Before her rose a final cliff face, vertical, impossible. Yet somehow she knew this was the way. As she stood wondering how to proceed, the textile began to move on its own, unwrapping from her body, spreading like wings. But wings that caught not air but something subtler, the currents of intention that flow between all things. She found herself lifting, not flying exactly but being drawn upward, as if the monastery above had sent down invisible threads to pull her home. The ascent was dreamlike, peaceful, her body weighing nothing. The textile supporting and surrounding her like warm water. She passed through clouds that felt solid, then through apparently solid rock that felt like clouds. Reality had become negotiable, subject to interpretation, responsive to the quality of attention brought to it. The nest of clouds revealed itself gradually, first as a suggestion of structures in the mist, then as actual buildings, though buildings unlike any she had seen. They seemed grown rather than built, emerging from the mountain like thoughts from a vast stone mind. The walls were partially transparent, or perhaps it was that her vision had changed, allowing her to see through what had always been transparent. Monks moved through the structures, but moved might be the wrong word. They existed at different points, appearing and disappearing without crossing the space between. Their robes were the color of sky, of cloud, of the space between stars, making them nearly invisible until they chose to be seen. One approached her, or she approached him, or they approached each other. Distance and direction had become meaningless concepts. He was young in body but ancient in presence, his eyes containing the depth of someone who had looked beyond the edge of existence and found it familiar. "You brought it," he said. and his voice had the quality of an echo, as if he was speaking from very far away or very long ago. Or it brought you, or you became it, all equally true. He led her, or she followed, or they moved together through passages that might have been hallways or might have been gaps between thoughts. The monastery's interior was larger than its exterior, or perhaps space itself was different here, folding in on itself like fabric, like the patterns in the textile that still floated around her. Neither worn nor carried, but simply present. The Lama's chamber was at the highest point of the monastery, though height had become another negotiable concept. It was a simple room, containing nothing but a meditation platform and a window that looked out onto nothing. Everything. The view changed depending on the quality of looking. Sometimes showing mountains, sometimes showing stars, sometimes showing the inside of the room itself as if the window were a mirror. The Lama sat in the center of the room, and he was exactly what Dechen had expected, and nothing like what she had expected. He was ancient, his skin so translucent, she could see through to the light that seemed to originate from his bones. But he was also young, eternally young, existing in that timeless moment before aging begins. His eyes were closed, had perhaps been closed for days or years. But when Dechen entered, or when the textile entered with Dechen as its companion, he smiled. The smile transformed the room, made it larger and smaller simultaneously, filled it with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "So," he said without opening his eyes, his voice like wind that had been places no human had walked. The pattern completes itself. The thread returns to the spindle. The weaver becomes the woven. The textile moved of its own accord now, floating free from Dechen's body, expanding to fill the room. Its patterns were fully visible now, layers upon layers of meaning, teachings encoded in color and texture, entire philosophies written in the relationship between warp and weft. It was a book, a map, a doorway, a mirror, everything and nothing. "Do you know what you've created?" the Lama asked, and now his eyes were open. But they were not eyes. They were windows into space where stars were being born. "I didn't create it," Dechen heard herself saying, her voice sounding strange, distant, as if someone else was speaking through her. "It created itself. I was just the loom." The Lama laughed, and his laughter was like bells made of light. Yes, exactly. This is the final teaching, the one I have been waiting to give, or to receive, or to become. The separation between teacher and student, creator and creation, weaver and textile, all of these are just conventions, useful at certain stages, but ultimately, he reached out toward the textile, and where his fingers should have touched it, they passed through, or the textile passed through them, or they became each other. The patterns in the fabric began to move, really move, swirling like galaxies, like thoughts in the mind of space itself. "This will remain after I go," he said. And his voice was already fading, becoming part of the silence that lived beneath all sound. Not the textile itself that will dissolve like everything else, but what it teaches, what it remembers, what it dreams, that will continue, passing from thread to thread, weaver to weaver, until even the memory of its making is forgotten and only the pure teaching remains. Dechen wanted to respond, but found she had no words. Or rather, words seemed suddenly unnecessary. Everything that needed to be communicated was already present in the space between them, in the patterns that continued their slow dance through dimensions. Days passed, or moments, or centuries. Time had become completely fluid. She sat with the Lama, or he sat with her, or they both sat with the textile, which was teaching them something beyond language, beyond thought, beyond the reach of consciousness itself. Other monks would appear sometimes, drifting in like clouds, sitting for a while in the presence of the textile, absorbing something, leaving something. No one spoke. Speech would have been a diminishment, a reduction of the fullness that silence contained. And then one morning, if morning is the right word for when light began to predominate over darkness, the Lama was gone, not dead, not exactly, but transformed. His body remained, still sitting in perfect posture, but it had become translucent, crystalline, catching and refracting light like a prism. The textile had changed too. It no longer seemed separate from the room, from the monastery, from the mountain itself. Its patterns had expanded beyond the physical fabric, encoding themselves in the walls, in the air, in the spaces between molecules. Dechen understood it was time to leave, though leaving and staying had become the same action viewed from different angles. She moved toward the door, or the door moved toward her, and found herself in the passages of the monastery, which were also the patterns in the textile, which were also the pathways of her own consciousness. Other monks passed her, or she passed them, and in each passing, something was exchanged. A pattern, a teaching, a quality of silence that spoke louder than words. She realized she was carrying the textile within her now, not as memory, but as presence, woven into her being at such a fundamental level that she could never be separated from it. The descent from the monastery was not a journey, but a settling, like sediment in still water finding its natural level. She moved through landscapes that were also inside her, mountains that were thoughts, valleys that were pauses between heartbeats. Each step took her further from the monastery and deeper into it simultaneously. When she finally arrived back at Amalhamo's monastery, or when it arrived around her, she had been gone for seasons, or moments, or no time at all. The weaving hall was exactly as she had left it, and completely transformed. She could see now the patterns that had always been there, the teachings encoded in every thread, the wisdom that previous weavers had left behind like blessings. Amalamo was at her eternal loom, working on the same textile, or a different one, or the only textile that had ever existed. She looked up as Dechen entered, and smiled that smile that made her ancient face young. "So," she said, "you've returned, or arrived, or never left. All equally true." Dechen sat at her own loom, her fingers finding the threads without conscious thought, beginning to weave, or continuing to weave, or discovering that she had always been weaving. The pattern that emerged was new and ancient, hers and everyone's, a teaching and a question, complete and eternally becoming. The years that followed, or preceded, or existed outside the flow of time entirely, were marked not by events but by a deepening. Dechen became known throughout the valleys, or unknown, or both. as the one who wove textiles that couldn't quite be seen, that existed in the corner of vision, in the moment before sleep, in the space between thoughts. People would come seeking these textiles and leave with something else entirely, or with nothing, or with everything. Some said she could weave healing into cloth, others that her textiles were doorways to other realms. Still others claimed she didn't exist at all, that she was a story weavers told each other, a pattern that emerged from the intersection of all their individual practices. She worked mostly at night now, when the boundary between waking and sleeping was thinnest. Her textiles had become so fine they were barely visible in daylight, but in moonlight they glowed with their own subtle radiance, patterns within patterns within patterns, infinite recursions that led always back to the beginning. Sometimes young weavers would come to learn from her, and she would teach them the way Amalhamo had taught her, through silence, through presence, through the simple act of sitting together at the loom, letting the threads themselves become the teachers. Some stayed for days, some for years, some for just a single breath that contained lifetimes. As she aged, or grew younger, or remained exactly the same, Dechen understood more and more that she had become what she had always been seeking. Not a master weaver, but weaving itself. Not someone who created patterns, but the space in which patterns arose, dissolved, arose again. Her name faded from use, replaced by whispers, rumors, legends that might or might not be true. The silent weaver, the dream threader, the one who weaves between worlds, or sometimes just her, as if there were only one possible her being referenced. And in the weaving hall, late at night, when the monastery sleeps and snow falls like blessings on the roof, she continues her work, her fingers moving with the rhythm of breathing, of heartbeats, of the turning of prayer wheels in the wind, creating textiles that exist and don't exist, that can be seen only by not looking, that teach through their presence and their absence equally. The threads sing their ancient songs, silk and wool and cotton and nettle, each carrying its own memories, its own dreams. And through her hands, or through the hands that once were hers but now belong to the weaving itself, these songs interweave, creating harmonies that have never existed before and have always existed. Patterns emerge and dissolve like clouds, like thoughts, like the days themselves that blur one into another in the eternal rhythm of the loom. The sound of the beater compacting the threads becomes a heartbeat, becomes thunder in distant mountains, becomes the silence that contains all sounds. And if you were to enter that hall now, in this moment between moments, you might see her there, or not see her, or see through her to the patterns she's becoming. An old woman, young as morning, weaving dreams into fabric, fabric into dreams, until there's no distinction between the weaver and the woven, the pattern and the space it fills. The textile she works on has no beginning and no end. It extends backward through all the weavers who came before, forward through all who will come after. It's every textile that has ever been made, and the one textile that contains them all. The pattern shows mountains becoming clouds, becoming threads, becoming thoughts, becoming mountains again. The eternal cycle that has no starting point, no conclusion. And as your eyes grow heavy, As these words fade into the rhythm of your own breathing, you might feel yourself there in that weaving hall. The warmth of butter lamps, the soft sound of snow, the gentle rhythm of the loom like a lullaby, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself, steady, patient, eternal. The threads continue their dance, colors blending, patterns emerging and dissolving. And somewhere in those patterns, in the space between one thread and the next, between one breath and the next, the story continues, or ends, or never started at all. Just the eternal weaving, the endless pattern, the silence that holds all sounds. And Dechen, if that was ever really her name, continues her work, becoming lighter with each pass of the shuttle, more transparent, until she's indistinguishable from the patterns she creates, from the light falling through the windows, from the very act of weaving itself. This is how all weavers eventually disappear, not by leaving, but by becoming so present they merge with their practice. Their names forgotten, their faces dissolved into mountain mist, but their patterns continuing, thread by thread, breath by breath, in every textile that remembers, in every loom that dreams. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry, woven into the darkness between stars, the silence between heartbeats. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits in your dreams, or perhaps just peaceful sleep.